Cyber risk quantification uses industry-leading and highly vetted probabilistic models to more accurately describe the cybersecurity and technology-based risks facing an organization. CRQ lets you understand the cost of different events and even clarify the return on investment of mitigation of those events through real quantitative models. The reason cyber risk quantification is getting increased attention is that the traditional methods are simply not giving companies what they need. Looking at the likelihood and impact in the traditional way isn't helping organizations effectively prioritize efforts. Taking a quantitative approach shows risk in business terms and ties risk and mitigation activities back to dollars and cents, which means you can make better data-driven decisions.
So it's important to measure and quantify risk because measuring risk allows us to make comparisons on a level playing field. What we found is traditionally the methods that were used to quantify and to attempt to measure risk didn't meet that goal. And they talked about things around compliance and maturity and these types of things, but they weren't in units that the business could understand and make decisions about. So it's important to quantify risk because that allows us to speak the same language and to understand what our risk landscape looks like so that we can ultimately make that informed decision. The methods to assess risk quantitatively are probabilistic. Inherently, there's a level of uncertainty in any future-facing forecast. And the reality of that is that we need to have methods and tools that allow us to express that uncertainty. We'll never be able to predict the future, but what we can do is that we can talk about the probabilities of things occurring. And by using these methods that have been tried and tested for years and decades even, we're able to talk about risk in quantitative terms and express the uncertainty that's inherently present in a way that not only helps us make decisions about those risks, but also allows us to understand where we have gaps in our knowledge and what we can do to close those.
What can be done with CRQ that cannot be accomplished with traditional risk assessment methods? There's a lot of interesting stuff in this space that can be used to really supplement traditional risk assessment methods in a way that makes them more valuable to an organization. So historically, using a controls-based or bottom-up control-based risk assessment method gives you a lot of gaps. And I'm sure you're all familiar with all of the different ways of reporting those, high, medium, low, etc. But it really tells you where to focus your efforts. A good example of a client who wanted to do a quick simulation of a patch to fix a known vulnerability, and going through a controls-based risk assessment would tell them that, yes, this vulnerability is here. Maybe it has a CVSS score of 10 or something, but that doesn't make it organization specific. So we were able to, with some of the data that we had already put together from prior risk assessments or risk analyses, produce a quick on-the-fly quantified annualized loss expectancy specific to the organization and to that risk. That they were able to use and show kind of what the business case for the effort to patch that was. And that's something you just can't do as easily with a traditional risk assessment method, is really kind of quickly come to that quantified range and make effective comparisons with other vulnerabilities or issues in the environment. And that's something we see a lot of value in with clients, is just that risk comparison quantification piece. So what capacity and resources are needed to operationalize cyber risk quantification? There's a wide range of skills and tools you need to have access to, but it really depends on the range. Whether you're looking at a low-scale ad hoc analysis just to be integrated with your existing risk management process, or if you're looking to implement a kind of fully operational quantified risk management program that looks at all risks across the environment. And kind of on the low scale of that, a lot of these concepts are easy to operationalize. You need a lot less data that you think, and once you build that data, you can work to build a library of all the ranges and probabilities you're using in your analyses that make these easier over time, that bring them up to scale. So the capacity that's needed for that is really Excel and a few other, just a basic understanding of cybersecurity and statistics concepts. But as you move along the maturity spectrum, it's important to use the technology that's available to us and some of the, more advanced statistical analysis packages that can help you organize the data better and reperform these types of analyses over time. A working knowledge of cybersecurity and statistics, as I mentioned, is helpful, but really the skill is in measurement and interpretation, and subject matter experts can help you get a lot of the data you need. But the key skill you need is to understand what data to ask for, how to scope scenarios appropriately, and how to relate those concepts to executive management who, sometimes may or may not have PhDs in statistics. So while a lot of this can be done with lower engines, it's really the art form or the skill of cyber risk quantification that you need to internalize to make this valuable.
A common question when organizations start on their risk quantification journey is, where do you start? The reality is that you can typically start a lot smaller than you think you can. It's not always a good idea to have a big bang rollout of a program and overhaul all the risk assessments that your organization is doing and create too much of a change at one time. We recommend picking a single project or a single use case that is going to be useful. And the reality is that a useful project is one that ultimately helps you make a decision. So choose a risk assessment or an analysis that is going to help solve a problem, answer a question, and is going to resolve a pain point within the organization, something that you couldn't do with traditional risk assessment methods.
How do I integrate this with existing ERM frameworks? Often in enterprise risk management, programs already have expressed a risk appetite level or an organization-wide view of risk that's set and agreed upon and reviewed annually by executive leadership. And cyber risk quantification is a great way to plug information technology and security risks into that using tried and true methods of quantifying cyber risks. So while historically, it's always on the enterprise risk management radar, some nebulous cyber risk, we can use these scenarios to more succinctly state what the potential loss events are to our organization, what they're going to potentially cost us in the next year, and how that marries up to our existing risk appetite. And where we don't have that agreed upon risk appetite, using these scenarios to run simulations for management and say, here's a list of all of the potential risk scenarios you may experience in the cyber area over the next year. What, based on this level of potential loss, are you comfortable with these? Is this something we can use to actually start looking through and setting what that tolerable level of risk appetite is? So that's a great way to start. And then a lot of these concepts are also applicable to other areas of enterprise risk management. So where your organization may not already be using things like loss distribution approaches, Monte Carlo simulations, and ranges of potential loss for your enterprise risk management program, applying some of these same concepts, more broadly to operational risk, is also seeing a huge, surge recently in order to give management more comfortable that they're accounting for all of the ranges of possible and probable future loss in their enterprise risk management program. How does an institution go about transforming to cyber risk quantification versus traditional risk assessment approaches? And I think the first place to start here is you don't have to think of it as an either or question. Cyber risk quantification marries nicely with traditional risk assessment approaches, and they complement each other very well. It's the easiest way to start, and some of the ways we approach these projects frequently is by taking the results or gaps that we encounter in traditional risk-based or traditional risk assessments and craft those into more scenario-based risks. So if you have a risk that is, this vulnerability exists, think about it in the form of there's a scenario where a hacker takes advantage of this vulnerability and results in a loss of customer PII or something like that. And often an entity already has to do elements of this for things like NYDFS or HIPAA or PCI, a risk assessment or risk analysis of this magnitude that identifies these types of scenarios, identifies the threats, vulnerabilities, and assets is already required in a lot of those types of analyses. So it's just bringing more of a scenario-based view into it, and then doing the work to quantify those risks, which a lot of the time is doing a little more upfront data gathering, whether it's looking at historical risks or historical loss in your environment, what costs have been, benchmarking to other organizations and other publicly available data like the Verizon DBIR and some of the Advisen, Scientia Institute data sets that have been out there and published, and then using those to look at the range of loss related to a specific scenario that your organization could experience. So in short, kind of starting with those traditional risk assessment gaps and approaches, doing the work to quantify some of those risks. And then, of course, the hard part is kind of the education of leadership and executive management, and making sure that, you're quantifying it in a way that they understand and get value from. But often that ends, once you've done that successfully, their question is often, why haven't we been doing this all along?
A great place to start is to think of a problem or a question that you need to solve, or a decision that you're struggling to make. Something that is real and tangible, but you just need a little help with. An example could be that you are looking at different resiliency solutions, or trying to decide on a move from on-prem to cloud-based infrastructure. If you're not interested in that, you can also evaluate the ROI on planned investments, which could help you prioritize which activities you should really do now and which could come later down the road. Even beyond that, you can also perform a top risk analysis where you identify the top risks facing your organization more holistically and apply CRQ to quantify those risks and really understand what your loss exposure is.
How can an organization be confident in the results of CRQ given the uncertainty and lack of data that we all have in our environment? First, we say this all the time, you have a lot more data than you think already. And so it can be easy to overcome some of that uncertainty by bringing in more data sources, using the ones that are available to you to build ranges. Think about all of the data we have related to past years of cyber breaches, historical occurrence rates, number of devices in your environment, even down to phishing click test rates, where you have users doing mock phishing exercises, and the rate of users that click on those tells us something about the likelihood of experience loss in your environment. So I think using all the data that's available to you is important. And the second key piece is that uncertainty is built into the model. Measurement is a reduction in uncertainty, and it's not an elimination of it. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty, and a trained cyber risk quantification analyst is really skilled and well-versed in taking those various data points and making calibrated estimates in ranges appropriate to the level of data that you have and the level of precision you need for the analysis you're doing. And the good thing is that the size of those ranges tells you a lot about how certain or uncertain your estimate is. So while the size of your range can be used to convey to management the level of uncertainty you experience. If we have a risk with a minimum loss of $1 million and a maximum loss of $100 billion, compared to a risk with a minimum of $5 million in loss and a maximum of $10 million, that tells us something about the potential ranges of loss that are useful. We can see that there's a much wider range potential loss on one than the other. So while that may not be precise, it tells us something about the range of loss we could experience. And it's all about using the data to make effective comparisons. And comparisons don't require absolutely precise data to provide a useful decision-making data point for management.
Managing cyber risk is really no different than managing any other operational or business risk. What we've found is that quantifying risk in a way that enables us to manage it as a business risk is important. That's why we use financial models and quantify risk in financial terms to understand loss exposure, because these are terms that are easily understood by the business and allow us to make investment and business decisions about treating that risk that we wouldn't be able to do using any other method.
So cyber risk quantification leverages the FAIR cyber risk framework. If you are interested in learning more, I recommend, if you haven't already, joining the FAIR Institute, which is a professional organization where you can find resources and connect with other professionals that are already passionate about the subject. And then you can also visit Protiviti's website at protiviti.com/FAIR.
In the next 5 to 10 years, I would expect to see risk quantification really taking off from an adoption standpoint. But I think what'll be interesting to see is that, as organizations are starting to identify new use cases and new ways to leverage cyber risk quantification, the data that goes into an analysis and the way that you use the results of an analysis are going to evolve. I'm really excited to see new innovative sources of data and data sets becoming available both publicly and within our clients that will enable a more accurate, a more precise, and a more predictive analysis of risk in the future. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, based on the pace that we've seen innovation growing so far, there's going to be some really exciting things coming out, both from a tool perspective, a data perspective, and a way that the company is leveraging these analyses to actually make decisions.
The global pandemic and resulting economic uncertainty has meant that organizations are taking a harder look at expenditures and trying to understand where to invest and what projects can be deferred. Using cyber risk quantification to quantify the numerous risks being faced will help organizations prioritize efforts, support decision-making, and refresh organizational priorities.